Hey everybody, welcome to Mishnah Mondays. You picked a good Monday. You picked a good Monday, folks. We are going to, I got a treat for you today. We're going to see some crazy stuff. We're going to see some crazy stuff today if we do it in time, if we push forth in time. Before I begin, I just want to say, I see Agnes Berinsky out there, and I just over the Shabbat started reading Agnes's new book. Agnes just put out a book, young adult book, and it is smart and funny and beautiful. And I tore through it on Shabbat, and I'm about halfway in, and I love it. And just so you know, this is one of our own, beautiful book here. Maybe if you want to put a link to it, but for all your young adult and older adult fans out there. Okay. Let's see. What I want to do today is to take us into Masechet Kilayim. And that's a tractate of the Mishnah, Kilayim. And the first thing that I want to say is that we have in the Mishnah, this code of Jewish law that we study, we have to distinguish a little bit between like rabbinic law and biblical law, because both things are happening in the Mishnah. When I say rabbinic law, I mean like new legislation or legislation that's not clear and obvious from the Torah, but even new legislation. And we know this, if you were with me last week, we studied Tractate Demai, which is a prohibition created by rabbis. We're in this body of agricultural law, Zra'im, the first order of the Mishnah. And the prohibition created by the rabbis because they were not sure that the Amei Aretz, the local people, were careful enough about tithing. And so they made all these sorts of prohibitions around tithing. They made prohibitions around buying that produce from people who might not be careful enough. That's a rabbinic law, right? That's just like given the circumstances, here's some new law that we need, entirely rabbinic law. What we're going to look at today is another kind of Mishnah. And I distinguish that because it's easy to think that the Mishnah is all just like a second body of law. There's the Torah, and then there's the Mishnah, and the rabbis are just, this is our new laws. But a lot of what they're doing in the Mishnah is unpacking and figuring out straightforward commandments that are in the Torah, right? And there are actually differing theories of the what's called the oral law, the Mishnah, the Talmud, and some of the theories, and I mean ancient theories, like Heschel has a whole book on this. I forget what it is. It's a very, very long name. Heavenly Torah Refracted Through the Generations is the way it's translated in English. But it's a book that tries to tease out the difference between Rabbi Akiva's school of interpretation and Rabbi Yishmael's, and the idea, these two schools, one is that everything in rabbinic law in the Mishnah is derived straight from the Torah, and it's just, even when you don't see it, it's like there's a clue in there for why you would do that. That doesn't quite work all the way down, because as we saw last week, this was clearly a rabbinic ordinance. And then the other theory is that the oral Torah is an entirely separate body of law, just a sort of a different thing that exists unto itself. And that also clearly, neither of these are absolutely true, but there are different theories about just how much of the Mishnah was, say, given to Moses on Mount Sinai, or just as a matter of interpretation, can be derived from the Torah. Okay, that's just like while we're learning Mishnah, we should know these things. But today we'll make that distinction clear by very quickly looking at a tractate of the Mishnah that's really focused on some very specific, although very strange, biblical commandments. Okay, let's begin with a blessing. We'll make a blessing over the sacred act of studying Torah. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'chivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Amen. Great. Okay, so let's see. I called this session Genetic Modifications in Jewish Law and Lore, and you'll soon see why, though I'm not using the term exactly as we use it today. Usually when we speak about genetic modification today, we're talking about genetic engineering, right? Actually going into the gene and fiddling with it. And I'm already way out of my depth, right? Like there are scientists out there, I see some scientists out there, so hopefully they'll help us along the way. I consulted with my stepfather, who is a scientist, and when we speak about genetic modification today, GMOs, things like that, we're talking about things where scientists have gone and fiddled with the gene. We today are going to be talking about something that I think can fairly be called genetic modification, though not really engineering, but close enough in its work and in its purpose that it I think eventually will allow us to reflect a little bit on that larger conversation of genetic alteration that we're still having today. So let's just keep that in mind. But first things first, because we are talking about a Torah law, let's go all the way back to the Torah. Okay. Let's see. Oh yes, somebody says in the chat that I got rid of the halo. Yes, I got rid of the halo. Do you see that behind me? I blacked it out. Did I say what Agnes's book was called, by the way? Sasha Masha, it's called. Sasha Masha. Really beautiful book. Okay, there's your source sheet. Okay, so let's take a look. See, my friend Randy is out there joining us from San Francisco again. Hi, Randy. Okay. Okay, here we go. All right, so here are the laws. We're gonna need to spend some time just in the Torah itself and just studying the laws as they appear in Leviticus and then are repeated in Deuteronomy. And first, as we read through them, I'll ask you to just keep track, just a few little verses here, but we've got a lot of laws, a lot of prohibitions. And the word for all these, the category word for all of these is kilayim. You'll see it come up soon. You shall observe my statutes. That word statutes is chukotai or chukim. That's going to become important for us. So chukim is the word to be thinking of there. You shall not mate your cattle with a different species. Behemtecha lo tarbia kilayim. You shall not sow your field with two kinds of seed. Now, when I say with a different species or with two kinds of seed, that's just a translation of the word kilayim, which it's as if what the Torah is really saying is, you shall not mate your cattle kilayim style. Sadcha lo tizra kilayim. You should not, your field, you shouldn't plant it kilayim. Shouldn't plant kilayim in it, okay? But we assume in context that, or we sort of we understand in context that that means mating your cattle with a different species, sowing your field with two kinds of seed. You shall not put on clothing from a mixture of two kinds of material. And this here, there's another word which some of you may have also heard of, which is shatnez, this particular kind of kilayim. Uveged kilayim shatnez lo yale alecha. Okay. Okay, so those are the laws as they appear in Leviticus. We could stop there, but it turns out that they pop up again in Deuteronomy, and we might as have all the material in front of us before we start analyzing it. So let's take a look. Deuteronomy, as is often the case, repeats some law and then adds some. You shall not sow your vineyard with a second kind of seed. Lo tizra karmecha kilayim. What's different there is vineyard. Else the crop from the seed you have sown and the yield of the vineyard may not be used. Right? If you do that, you can't use the crop. We'll get into the particulars of how that works later. And then some interesting additions. Lo tacharosh b'shor uv'chamor yachdav. You shall not plow with an ox and a donkey together. which seems very different and is in fact not called kilayim, but is spoken of in the same sweep here. And then finally, once again, lo tilbash shatnez, you shall not wear shatnez, clothing or cloth. Yeah, that's what I meant. Cloth combining wool and linen. Okay, so let's count them out. There are, as I count them, 6 prohibitions. As I count them, whatever. As I looked it up in the books and discovered 6 prohibitions. Let's start naming them. Anyone got all 6, or just like what are all the things that are forbidden? Just so we know all of the things we're talking about. And it's also just good to speak it out in plain language. What's forbidden?
Interbreeding animals.
Good. Interbreeding animals. That's one. So you can't, and we'll eventually see this animal. I'll give the classic example. You can't take a horse and a donkey and create a mule, right? That's one of those animals are close enough. You're not supposed to do that. Okay, what else?
Have 2 different kinds of animals work together.
Yes, to join 2 different kinds of animals together in plowing.
In plowing, right? Specifically.
Yeah, maybe working together generally, but yeah, specifically pulling together a plow. And various reasons given for that, but it does, as I mentioned, it does seem a little like of a different concern. So we can think about that. What else is forbidden? We've got 2. Elizabeth.
Well, the one we hear about the most is mixing materials in clothing.
Good, shatnez.
Right. But then there's also one I had never heard before, which sounds like planting certain seeds together, and it actually sounds like hybridizing. Like when you make avocados that are, that you actually have to hybridize.
Good. Okay, good. That's right. The classic case of kilayim is that you have 2 crops that are growing alongside one another. You shouldn't grow them too close to one another because first concern is they might, if you grow them too close, they might begin to crossbreed of their own accord, and that will produce some sort of third species. And so you have to be careful to keep the crops separate enough so that they don't grow together, right? Now that gives us now 4: the breeding animals, the plowing animals, shatnez, wool and linen, and then planting 2 things close together. I'm just going to give us one more because it's not obvious except by way of the rabbinic interpretation. They understand these prohibitions to mean both planting 2 seeds too close to one another and grafting, like intentionally taking 2 plants and grafting them together in order to deliberately produce a third plant, third species maybe. And those prohibitions that Elizabeth points us to, those are, I think, maybe the most important for us to keep in mind when we eventually start thinking about our own concerns around genetic modification, right? Because we're usually talking about modifying crops. Great, so planting and grafting. And then there's one more, which is very difficult to catch. Anyone catch there's a specific kind of prohibition. Ken?
Is that the vineyard?
Yes, it is. Yeah, thanks. Exactly right. What's distinct about that?
It says, don't sow thy vineyard with diverse seeds, lest the fruit of the seed which thou hast sown and the fruit of the vineyard be forfeited. Good.
There's a particular prohibition around vineyards. Thank you so much, Ken, noticing that so precisely. And the concern is, it is in a way just another form of kilayim, of just like crops commingling, but in particular when it comes to grapes and then bringing grains into the vineyard, so that somehow the and I don't know whether the concern was especially wine has a holy purpose, I don't know, but there's a specific concern around vineyards, bringing extra crops into the vineyards, and with that concern, in particular, there's a specific mention that you can't use anything once it's been contaminated in this way. Yeah, Elle?
Can intermarriage be extrapolated from this?
No.
Okay.
No, I would say not. Okay, so, okay, well, you know, it's like the rabbinic mind now is like making all these connections. I mean, I think what Yael's question suggests is there some underlying principle? Is there what is going on here? I mean, that's where we need to go next. Why do you think the Torah has got all of these very particular concerns about not commingling? And I think Yael's question implies, is this, I answered quickly because halachically, in the case of Jewish law, it's never been connected in that way, but is there some underlying concern of just not fiddling, like not mixing? Don't mix things. And why would that be? What's wrong with mixing? Payam?
I just have a question. When they say you can't sow with two seeds, does that mean if you have like a farm, it's only one kind of plant? Or does that mean you can't use two different kinds of the same, like wheat or something? Because those are two different things. I'm unclear on that.
What, in other words, what constitutes two different species? Yeah, you know, Payam.
Well, the seed part. It says when you can't sow with two seeds, because that can mean two different things. Do you know specifically? Like if someone only has wheat, does that mean they can only grow wheat, or can they also grow corn and wheat, etc. on their farm?
Yeah, they could grow corn. Maybe I'm not understanding your question. They can grow corn and wheat on their farm. They just can't grow them in the same plot. Someone understanding Payam's question better than me? Or Payam, you want to explain it again? What I'm missing?
I mean, it just says two kinds of seed. So I don't understand, like, what are the geographic, I mean, so you can have different plots on the same farm, like.
Yes.
Okay.
Oh, I hear what you're saying. You're saying you've got to, I'm sorry, I'm just dense here. And you have a field. Can you sow two kinds of seeds in your field? Payam's saying, well, take the verse literally. Can you not grow two different things at all? Must you be, and it's a great question, like, and the tradition has never gone that way. And I guess my mind is just locked in where I didn't understand the question because the answer is that, well, that's not the way it's been understood. But you can see how Payam is trying to do what the rabbis do, which is derive from these verses a law. So that's not the law, but you can see that's part of what the Mishnah is doing, is saying, oh, seems to be an extra emphasis in the vineyard. The vineyard must mean something else. Okay, we're still now in the, like we listed the prohibitions, but we're still wondering with these verses, what's going on? What is the rationale here? What's the, do you sense a value emerging or a concern of some particular sort? Peter, and then Rosalind.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of this to me looks like what happens when you move from a subsistence economy to a market economy. In other words, if you're just growing things for yourselves, it's easy to figure out what's there and what you're going to use, what you're not going to use. But if you're going to start commodifying and you're going to start selling different crops and different items, and I agree, it doesn't, the donkey and the ox obviously is about more practical, they won't work against each other. But in terms of the commodities, in terms of the crops you're growing or things you're weaving that you might be selling, being able to indicate with certainty what the item is crucial for how you sell it, how you export it to the wider world, because otherwise, people don't know what they're buying. And you could be, then you get into the issue of, well, how much of one thing is mixed with something else? And merchants like certainty, whereas people who are just growing only for themselves, it's less important. You could have a bunch of things, and I've been in fields in Mexico where people are only growing crops for themselves, and they've got all kinds of stuff mixed in. But once you start to sell, then you've got to say, okay, I've got this much of this crop, this much of another crop. So it's not really a theological rationale, but it may have something to do with the context, I guess.
No, I love that. Okay, great. I've never thought through the problem in that way, that this might be a practical concern about, you know, large scale agriculture. So grateful to have a policy mind like yours on the law and economics mind like yours in the right. I think that's a fair. We are after all speculating, right? So that's a fair speculation. Roslyn, what were you going to say? Oh, Roslyn, we can't hear you. Can you unmute yourself? No, actually, you were unmuted. Try again.
I wonder, I think something might be up with your microphone settings, Rosalind. I'll message you privately, maybe Rebecca, if you want to take someone else.
I'll circle back to you, Rosalind,
Yeah.
if we can get it fixed. I'm sorry about that. Jamie?
Yeah, I wanted to say that this seems to fit for me with the idea of Hashem as the God of Kedusha, like separating, and that this God is sort of obsessed with making distinctions. And that's kind of the spiritual ethos of at least part of the religion is just we're the kingdom of priests. And priests meaning like just the ones that make distinctions. And so there's all sorts of arbitrary, maybe practical distinctions, kashrut, and this, and many others separating from other peoples, and just constantly having to keep things apart, whether arbitrarily or for good reason.
Great. I love that. And this builds on the suggestion that Yael gave us earlier, that perhaps there's some the actual concern with distinction, boundary, designation, specification. Jamie is suggesting kedusha, meaning when's the first time kedusha, the word is like holiness, but it is also distinction. When's the first time that's used? Shabbat. Shabbat is distinct from the rest of the days. We are a holy nation, meaning we're set apart and distinct. Right? So is this just like there's something about Jewish spirituality? And Jamie says, I think also very smartly, that that kind of spirituality we see a particular concern in the priesthood. These laws emerge in the priestly book, Leviticus. Do they just want things to be in order and separate and non-contaminated and everything in its right place? Is that just like there's some spiritual principle of order, distinction, separateness? Elisa, I see you responding with alacrity here. Do you want to unmute? Yeah.
That's entirely correct. And we see that from Breshit onward, that God's mode is in separation, but it's also in creation. And it seems to me that these laws are saying, let's not ourselves create further species. That is not our job. That's a divine job.
Okay. Elisa gives us the famous answer of Nachmanides. In a debate, we call these things debates, though the people weren't actually in a debate, but a famous debate between Rashi and the Ramban, Rashi, Rabbi Shlomo Yitzchaki, and the Ramban, Rabbi Moses Nachmanides. And take a look here. I've included it on your sheet. And let's just bring, I've been asking this group, what do you think? And I've been getting some really interesting answers. Here are the answers that Rashi and the Ramban provided. And Rashi's is a funny one, because what he says is, all of these things, you shall observe my statutes. And again, I told you to pay attention to that word statutes, chukotai, or chukim, as they are called. It's a particular, like Jews have a lot of words for law, and I could have just translated this as my laws, but a particular kind of law that is understood by Jewish tradition to be just sort of a decree, because it's related to the word for kind of cutting. So you just chokek, you just sort of designate something, a decree. Anyway, so Rashi, picking up on that, says, you shall observe my statutes. Well, then the following things must be statutes, and here's his understanding of what it means for something to be a decree rather than a different kind of law. You shall not, things like you shall not make your cattle of a different species, they are statutes because chukim, statutes, are decrees of the king for which no reason is given. Okay, this is the like class traditional understanding of what are chukim, gzerat melech she'ein tam ladavar, decrees of the king for which no reason is given. In other words, what is the purpose of this law? Why do we do these things? Because God said so. I see some shrugs out there. And maybe it's, we don't know, right? We don't know. But the force of that is that Rashi's saying, and we don't get to know. God said so. There are some laws, and Rashi is saying these ones are signaled out as chukim because there are a lot of other things in the book of Leviticus that seem like laws with very clear reason, right? Like honoring not cursing your parents, right? That comes in that same chapter. Okay, so that's Rashi's answer. There's no reason for this at all. We don't understand this at all. And here comes the Rambans. This is Nachmanides. Ramban and Nachmanides are sort of interchangeable. There are two ways of referring to the same guy. Ramban here says, you shall observe my statutes. He quotes Rashi, quotes this, what we just saw. Rashi says that there's no reason for this at all. And he enters into a debate around these commandments, but really a deeper debate about the very nature of Jewish law. He says, no, chukim are not, there's no reason for them at all. Right? What did Rashi say? No reason is given. You know, that even that is bad translation. No, for which there is no reason for the thing is probably a better translation. Rashi's language is more like, there's no reason at all. And Ramban says, no, chukim are like the decrees of a king who decrees it with his authority without revealing the purpose of the people. But come on, all God's laws have a correct reason and purpose. And then he gives Elisa's answer. And the reason for Kilayim is that God created species in the world, in everything with a soul, in plants, and in everything that moves, and gave them the ability to reproduce such that the species survive with them forever, so long as the blessed God wants the world to exist. So God commanded that they be able to produce according to their species and that they never ever change. That's a lot to say. What is his source for this? It's actually small but pointed, which is a word that keeps appearing in the first chapter of Genesis. As it says when it's describing all of creation, it says, leminehu, leminehu, leminehu. Everything according to its species. You'll see that word pop up a lot in the first chapter of the Torah. And the Ramban is telling us that emphasis is deliberate. These species are intentional and they are meant to be and last as they are. And so anyone who crosses two species together changes and denies the work of creation as if they are thinking that the Holy Blessed One did not perfect the world completely, and this person wants to help with God's creation of the world by adding creatures to it. Who do you think you are? God point 2? Oh, 2.0? Point 2. God 2, like, who do you think you are? You're fiddling with the wonder of creation. Right? You're playing God. Okay, and as I say that, I'm sure at playing God, you can hear some of our cultural conversation, right? Cloning. Is cloning okay? Or are we getting into areas where we don't belong? We're fiddling with the order of creation. And by the way, why is that a problem? Like, let's try to articulate what's the concern. Elisa and the Ramban here have told us that maybe the Torah doesn't want us messing with God's creation. So, okay, on the one hand, that's a reason, but why? What's the concern there? Okay, I won't ask you to directly respond to that, or hands up before, but now we've got some of your answers and some of the tradition's answers in our midst. So let's turn to Ari.
Pleasure to be back with you. It's
Ari.
I was going to make the same point about God's creation. What came to me when I read this is it's sort of about a proper role for mankind in a way. You know, there's the famous in Bereshit, you know, be fruitful and multiply, and you shall have dominion over everything that lives and crawls. And I'm getting the line wrong, but to me, the dominion it's like being a caretaker in a way. It's not to create something new, but to assure everything is in its proper place. You know, it's sort of similar to, like, you know, why was Adam and Eve kicked out of the Garden of Eden, right? They grew too smart, or they went for something beyond what was their place. And it's got an element, which is totally true, of not creating other things because that's against God's place, but it's also not you yourself doing things that are out of your place. And it also has this sort of Platonic ideal thing, right? There's a Platonic ideal of, you know, these crops, and you sort of, you know, you keep that world, which is really quite beautiful. And I think very different, not just from our modern, you know, debate about cloning, but like, right, this is like Frankenstein or Prometheus, right? Like throughout the Western tradition, even the non-Jewish Western tradition, that creation goes awry, or that, you know, we can mess up creation, I think is a pretty widespread thing.
A persisting anxiety, I think, that you can see threaded through all kinds of mythologies. And I think part of what's so helpful about your framing, Ari, is that there is an indication in the Torah itself, but also just because of who we are and how we are, that we should be in control of the earth to a certain extent, right? Like, we're the most intelligent creatures. We're capable of manipulating, like, what does it mean to say we shouldn't mess with creation? Should we not chop down trees to build houses? I mean, maybe not, I don't know. Like, there's an ethic to take seriously, but I mean, should we not manipulate the natural order? Should we not dig a hole? In other words, we are manipulated. We have dominion on the earth. How careful should we be with that power? Right? How careful should we be with that power? And I do want now to start talking a little bit about GMOs. Anyone here try not to eat GMOs? Is that like a concern? Anyone feel like, I don't want to out your dining practices, but like, you see it on the products, right? Like, what's that? And here I talked to my stepfather about this. He used to work in the Department of Agriculture here in California, and you know, there is a debate around GMOs. It's a somewhat controversial, you know, field. The genetic modification of mostly crops in this sense. Usually we don't speak about genetically modifying animals. They're clones, but that's different. And okay, so why would we genetically modify plants? Well, we want better plants. Plants that are resistant to disease, plants that are bigger, plants that last longer, plants that taste better. It's just it's an intelligent way of farming, right? But why are GMOs so suspect? Well, I mean, there's nothing particularly wrong with them. It's not like they're necessarily like chemicals, or just they've been modified to grow different. Why are people? So I think I want to start talking about them now, because I think my stepfather even said this. He's a scientist. So he said, you know, a lot of people just have this idea that it's just wrong. It's just wrong. And that feels to me like, oh my gosh, there's this lingering ethic that comes out of an ancient worldview, but we still feel when we talk about cloning and genetically modifying engineering things, that there's something, we should be careful. We should be careful. Now, I asked my stepfather, well, but do you mean to say that it's a weird idea we have, it's like a sacred idea we have, but it's not, there's nothing real about it. And he gave me a couple of examples of, no, it is actually worth being cautious, because one example he gave is squash varieties. They all have certain properties and certain tastes, but the squash in particular, when you grow them too close together and they do, like kilayim, they commingle, the squash that is created from the two squash, this is not true for all species, but most of them, he said, is inferior. It's just a worse squash with less taste, less nutrients. So that's interesting, like biblical code. But here's an even more practical concern. He gave me another example, which is that there's a pesticide that is made up of a bacteria. It's not a bad bacteria generally, but you spread it on the plant and it wards off pests. So some farmers got the idea to start breeding the plant to contain that bacteria, which is not harmful to those who would consume it, but so the plant would naturally ward off these pests. So they did. But then because the plant had that presence of that bacteria so uniformly, make sure I get this right, because it was so uniform and so standard, the pest began to adapt to it and eventually evolved to not be sensitive to that bacteria because it was so ubiquitous, so frequent. And then it was useless. Like because it was so inherent to the plant, now that pesticide, the bacteria itself was useless. So
Exactly.
you can begin to see how this concern about messing with the order of things, you can imagine, that was helpful for me to begin to imagine how, oh, maybe there's some real world concern. And I want to turn it back to the group and to think about the real concerns here around manipulating things. And then also the spiritual concerns of just sort of being the anxiety about messing with creation. And I'm curious where you all land along that spectrum, or if that whole concern doesn't feel particularly alive to you. Judah, let's hear from Judah.
I know when I normally talk about GMOs to people, the main thing people criticize is like the business practices of Monsanto and stuff, and have like the wind blows your seeds and they like sue you, and that's obviously horrible. And I was thinking that doesn't really relate here, because how would the Mishnah and the Torah have predicted that? But it's almost like if you're in a position to create something so new that like gives you an amount of power that kind of is unnatural, so it kind of paves the way for then malicious business practices.
Good.
I don't know.
Good. And since you mentioned Monsanto, let's talk about another concern around genetic, not even necessarily engineering, although that's part of it, but just sort of control of how the species grow, which is that one version of the apple will become dominant. You begin to just sort of like breed that apple, and then and you make it more powerful. Suddenly there's no other kinds of apples to eat. And God created this world with I think hundreds of kinds of apples. I believe that's so. Hundreds of kinds of apples, and we're gonna lose that because we fiddled with things too much, right? And in this case, deliberately so. Okay.
Hello.
Who is speaking up?
Judith Plants. Couldn't see a hand raised thing. So
The hand raise thing is in the participant feature. If you click participant on the bottom, and also anytime you're able to show your camera, you come on my screen, so I see you quicker. I also just like seeing people while they're talking. So if you can't, you can't, but that also helps. Judith, go ahead.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm at work, so officially I'm not even supposed to be listening, but but yeah, two issues. Number one, piggybacking on the other gentleman's thing about Monsanto, a big concern was copyrighting food. So when they use these GMOs and they create these new plants and stuff, they have patents on them. So they have these food monopolies, and there's a lot of concern about people now, businesses owning food, just like there is about the farming practices with the chemicals. And, when Monsanto has these farms and they make the farmers only use their chemicals, et cetera, et cetera. So that was one concern that a lot of the people that are against GMOs are, that they're patenting these new food items, and you can only buy from them. The other thing, which you had alluded to earlier, as a registered nurse, I see these superbugs all the time. And so there's a lot of concern that once you create something resistant to the bacteria, that doesn't really solve the problem. It creates new problems, because new bugs, they arise, and they're not resistant anymore. They adapt, they evolve. So that's another concern. And then there's one other one as well, that very often, I can't remember exactly, but a lot of foods are genetically modified in more natural ways, but introducing certain chemicals and things into food, we ingest that. So we don't always know the effect that those things will have on our bodies after we ingest them. This thing might cause corn to be resistant to a certain bug infestation, but it may cause some mutations in us. We're having much more food allergies now. All of a sudden everyone's allergic to peanuts and to this and to that.
Okay, yeah, great. Yeah, you're giving us so many features of, I think, what is a growing understanding that I think that we have now in a way that maybe we didn't have 100 years ago. Like 100 years ago, we might have looked at these texts like, in the sort of like, the afterglow of the Enlightenment and said, well, God, this is so silly. The order of creation and like being careful about God's little universe. Like now I think we have a much deeper sense of what it means to screw around with an ecosystem and how perilous that can be. What does it mean to start like messing with things, and do you throw the whole system out of alignment, out of whack? So thank you for that, Judith. I'm going to take two more comments, and then we're gonna take a bit of a twist here. Wendy.
So this is in a different realm, but I'm thinking about this. When we look at these texts, there's stuff underneath it. And I keep thinking that these things that were created by God are here for a reason. They come together, and our work is to embrace what God has given us already, and to see how we can make that work together. That's like, these are building blocks for us to work with God. We talk about, we are co-creators in the world. We were talking earlier about creating new species. And what maybe, in a sense, what God is asking us to do is take what he's given, she's given, and see how can there's a reason that all these things have been placed here. There's something that was this divine plan in the first place. And our work here is to figure out what that is. How, with what we have, can we make this better, make this place a better place from what God has even given us to make it.
I love that. I love, as usual, Wendy's beautiful, almost poetic phrasing, because we have been talking about not messing with the work of creation, but what Wendy is describing is something like given what Ari mentioned earlier, which is that we do mess with, we manipulate, we have power over nature, and it would be hard for us to imagine not using tools but Wendy is saying, but what would it mean to work and build and plant in harmony with nature, with some awareness of the natural order and fitting ourselves into it and playing off it. And there's a broad environmental ethic that can develop from the notion that we see things, we see the place of things, and we honor that. Okay. I said two comments. I have such a treat for you that I feel like I must plow forward a little bit. I see we're coming down to the end of the hour, and I'm going to take a sharp turn now. This is good. This work that we've done to try and get to the bottom of, or maybe just the surface of, what is Kilayim and what is the concern here. This is important, and now we're going to go into the Mishnah, although I will now admit to you, we're not going to study the Mishnah itself much today. It is very intricate, spends a lot of the time thinking about, what constitutes different kinds of species and different kinds of seeds and different kinds of plants. In order to understand the Mishnah, let's see if I can show you here. There's all kinds of, like you get all these kinds of pictures, diagrams of like what it means to plant things. You see that there? So it's like fun if you're a graphing person. But I'm going to take you on a little tour through one of the chapters of Kilayim, and I'm going to narrate it as we go. But I want to get to the last to the last Mishnah that we're going to look at today, because there's something in it that is one of, I think, my favorite moments in the Mishnah altogether. One of the wildest things I've ever seen in Jewish literature. So let's take a look. It's quite a promise, right? Let's see how this lives up. Okay, so we're late in Masechet Kilayim, chapter 8. We finally start talking about, okay, so how does all that? You told me how to plant things, but what are the basic prohibitions? And these are they. Kilayim of the vineyard. It is forbidden both to sow and to allow to grow, and it is forbidden to derive benefit from them. Ken noted this earlier. The Kilayim in the vineyard is particularly strict in that you cannot use anything that comes from it. There's a distinction the rabbis will draw between that and Kilayim of other seeds. It is forbidden both to sow and to allow to grow, but it is permitted to eat them, right? So if someone gives you a pluot, you can eat it, right? But you shouldn't be growing it yourself, and all the more so to derive benefit from them. Kilayim of clothing is permitted in all respects, except that it is forbidden to wear them. Well, that sounds weird, but what they're saying is that's the primary prohibition, is to wear a garment of wool and linen, but not necessarily to weave or to use the garment for something else. It's a limited prohibition. Kilayim of beasts, of animals, it is permitted to raise and to keep. It is only prohibited to crossbreed them. So if you find a mule or you buy a mule, that's fine, but you can't create a new animal, okay? All right, so those are the basic prohibitions. I mean, we could spend time thinking about why this and why that, but that's not my concern today. I'm gonna move forward. This just to give you a sense of, okay, where are we gonna go from here? Well, they wanna start thinking about what does it mean to crossbreed animals? What do we have to be concerned about? Well, here's the things that we have to be, these are the sorts of unions we have to be concerned about. A beast, meaning a behema, which is a domestic animal or one that is raised in a domestic way, with another beast of another species, right? So cow with, I don't know, sheep. It's probably not gonna happen, but whatever. A wild animal with a wild animal, two different species. Cattle with a wild animal. The two words here are behema, cattle, and chaya, wild animal, and a chaya with a behema. And why do they say it both ways? Because they're talking about parentage. Okay, like which of the which is, male and female. An unclean beast with an unclean beast of another species, a clean beast with a clean beast of another species, an unclean beast with a clean beast with an unclean beast. They're forbidden for plowing, and it's forbidden to pull them or lead them tied together. Really deep in the details here. We're not even going to analyze this. I just want to give you a feeling for the kind of thinking that is going on in this chapter. And one more layer before we get to the final Mishnah. If you are starting to feel a little like dizzy or lost, that's intentional. I want you to see how deep in the game we're getting here. And now that we're thinking about crossbreeding animals, so then we start thinking about, well, what if the animal is a mule, but the father is a donkey, but the mother is a horse? Is that different from the mother being a horse and the father being a donkey? Does that create a different kind of species? Are there different kinds of rules? Okay, so going through those things, and that takes up Mishnah 8:4. All those born from horses, even though their father is a donkey, are permitted with one another. All those born from donkeys, even though their father is a horse, are permitted one another. But those born from a horse and with those born from donkeys are prohibited one with another. Okay, lots of just sort of wading through the laws here. And then suddenly we turn to Mishnah 8:5. We're still talking about mules. And mules, this picks up on the last one, mules of uncertain parentage. You don't know who's the mother and who's the father. You can't crossbreed them to one another. But a ramach, which is a horse, a mule with a a horse mother, you can breed to horses, okay? And then the Mishnah continues and gives us a bunch of other categorizations. The masters of the field are considered a chaya, a wild animal. Rabbi Yossi says they cause impurity in a tent if they die, like a human being. The hedgehog and the bush mole are considered a chaya, a wild animal. As for the bush mole, Rabbi Yossi says in the name of Beit Shammai, an olive size of its carcass renders a person carrying it unclean, and a lentil size of its carcass renders a person touching it unclean. Okay. Whew. I don't know if I have your forbearance. I don't know if you're still with me. But did you notice something strange in that last Mishnah? I mean, there were lots of things that were strange. This whole realm of law is strange. There's something particularly eye-catching in that last Mishnah. Anyone? Yeah, somebody say it. Somebody unmute yourself and say it.
The
the rodent
is different.
What's that?
The measurement is different. A lentil or a.
Okay. Here's this may be a big fail on my part in terms of like setting this all up. But the thing that I wanted to point your attention to was these masters of the field. Adnei Hasadeh. All of a sudden they start talking about all these different kinds of animals, and they start with the masters of the field. So what are the masters of the field? What does that mean? And Rabbi Yossi says they create impurity the same way that a human being does. When a human being dies in a tent, that creates impurity. Same thing with these masters of the field. Okay, so I'm going to give you two answers that are given by classic commentators in the tradition. Here's the first one. Masters of the field, says the Yachin. This is a 19th century commentary. Masters of the field, that is men of the field. And it seems to me that this is about the Waldmensch, right? It's Yiddish over there, the Waldmensch, the wild man, the Waldmensch, called the, and I didn't translate this because I want to give you a chance for you Hebrew readers. What is this here? What's this word? Anyone?
Orangutan.
Called the orangutan. The orangutan, I think that's right. The orangutan, which is a kind of giant monkey with a height and shape very much like a person. Okay, that's one answer. That's one answer, is that these masters of the field, and what a strange thing. They're suddenly like talking about all these animals, and then there's these masters of the field, and it must be these monkeys. And it's clear that this guy's never seen an orangutan, right? But it's like, you know, there are certain, I've heard of these monkeys out there that look like people. And then that's one of the answers given in the tradition. But here is the other, the more classic answer. And this is what I have been waiting all hour to show you. And it is this. The Bartenura, the most classic commentator on the Mishnah, says that the master of the field is a wild animal that grows in the fields, that has a kind of big cord coming out of the root in the earth from where it gets its nourishment. And it's also called the Yadua, for it is the Yidoni written of in the Torah. There's a prohibition against consulting with a Yidoni or using a Yidoni for some sort of prophetic sorcery purpose. It is joined from its navel to that cord coming out of the ground, and it appears human in form in its facial features, arms, and legs. And no creature should approach within the length of that cord, for it tears and kills everything that comes close. When people want to hunt it, they shoot arrows from afar at its cord until it is severed, and then it screams out a bitter cry and dies immediately. I mean, come on, folks! That is too good. It is just too good. It is, I live for this stuff. It's like those moments where you're like plowing along in a boring tractate in the Mishnah, and all of a sudden you've got this wild animal connected to the ground through its like, umbilical corded into the ground, and it attacks everything that comes around it. And you have to shoot arrows at its cord, at which point it lets out a bitter cry and dies. Okay, now I know, like, I mean, for me, that's worth it. We could just go home. I know that a lot of you are thinking, wait, but we're just having this conversation about GMOs and Kilayim and all that. Like, And then suddenly you took the last 15 minutes of class and rushed to this weird Mishnah that like alludes to something that the tradition thinks is either an orangutan or some sort of mythical Lovecraftian creature. Okay, but I want to end on this question. What's going on here? Why is this kind of monster appear in the middle of Tractate Kilayim? What is it? If these readers are right, that there's something strange about this. All of a sudden there's this animal mentioned that is a mysterious master of the field with human form, right? Why do you, we don't get in rabbinic literature too much into fantasy, into just pure like monsters and creatures, though it exists. But here in the Book of Law, to include some speculation as to this Waldmensch, this sort of like wild creature out, this Bigfoot-like creature out there, I would love to just close by thinking a little bit, given our conversation about the order of creation and our prohibition against messing with things, what is this telling us? That one of the things that the rabbis thought about when they thought about the creatures out there was this strange master of the field. Does anyone have a read on this? Anyone want to offer some commentary on this strange beast that we've seen? I see a lot of blue hands, but anyone want to raise a hand and speak to this directly? Payam.
I think it's foreshadowing. It's almost saying if you do these, if you break these prohibitions, you're going to turn into this master of the field. You're going to be part human and you're going to be like attached to the ground because you've manipulated the ground, and you're going to turn into this monster and people are going to have to kill you or something.
So beautiful. So beautiful. What an incredible interpretation. We are the masters of the field. We are the masters of the field. Be careful being a master of the field, because you're going to distort things. You'll distort yourself. You'll turn into some weird wild creature. I love that. I love that interpretation. Anybody want to offer another? We got a different read on it? I love that. Peter.
I mean, I agree with that read, but I think it's also metaphorical. It's like if you screw with nature, nature will come back and bite you, the way we currently have all these storms and this disruption. If we disrupt the natural order, nature will rise up and will destroy us.
Good,
and so
good.
That's sort of another, maybe a more symbolic, more metaphorical, rather than a physical or literal meaning.
Good, good, good. Think this is the Frankenstein concern. Watch out. Watch out, you masters of the field. Watch out when you plant your plants or when you breed your animals. For God's sake, watch out when you're cloning, because you don't know what's going to come out. You could unleash monsters. And there's something about that that's very much like it is in the realm of Lovecraft and horror and like the creatures out there that may emerge. But there's also something very kind of practical about like that applies even to our conversation. Be careful of the creatures that you create. What havoc will they wreak upon on this earth, right? So I guess I'll just, we're at time now, but I guess I'll just close by saying what's strange about that is that by all kind of appearances here, if we were to understand this master of the field as a kind of that wild creature attached to the ground, it seems like the idea is that this is one of God's creatures. This doesn't seem like one of the things that we crossbred and created, right? So a kind of a third way of reading this that I'll offer as we close is that nature itself is wild and strange. There are scary enough things out there that should give us pause about playing creator, because nature is savage and vicious, and the forces that we're going to be like tampering with are like walking up to the master of the field. You don't know what's going to turn around and just bite you, right? Like, be careful, be thoughtful, be wise in your mastery of the field. Okay. I think we'll end there. I hope you appreciated that that surprise at the end as much as I loved including it. I'll see you next week, and join me on Wednesday night at 6 for biblical poetry and Thursday at noon for my Parsha class. Okay.
Rabbi Kasher, I put a note in the chat with some details about the Thanksgiving tikkun, but I wonder if you want to give a little bit of a verbal plug about it.
I'm so bad at this. Thank you so much. Yes. This coming Sunday, we have our Thanksgiving tikkun. You now have information about that in the chat, which is generally a beautiful program where we all come together and bring groceries and items for folks to be able to use to celebrate Thanksgiving. But this year, obviously, we're not gathering, but we're still dropping off the produce at our offices at IKAR and at the Silver Lake JCC. And then after that, as a way of recreating that event, Rabbi Tzadok and I are going to give classes at 11 on Zoom on the themes of Thanksgiving. Okay, that's it. Thanks, everybody.